my rule was that I would spend 10 hours of a day working on what government wanted me to do. But I would never go to bed without working 2 to 3 hours without working on what I wanted my government to do.
Hello, my name is Pranav Kothari and I work at Educational Initiatives. I'm so excited to have Dr. Santhosh Mathew to converse with today. I find Dr. Santhosh Mathew's profile amazing. He's been a professor and has pursued the scholarly side, has achieved a PhD. At the same time, he's been an Indian civil services for more than 32 years. After taking what he calls as voluntary retirement, he took a job that takes even more of his time and energy to be the country lead of social and public finance policy at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I'm really curious to hear everything about, how does a young IS aspirant today has to do things differently to succeed in the Indian administrative services. What are some things that foreign funders need to keep in mind as they're investing in the development of India so that they can achieve the maximum social return on investment? There are many opportunities in your career that would have allowed you to make a large-scale impact. And I want to understand whether a social entrepreneurship can be pursued within the IS. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Welcome and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
So if you could tell me some of the highlights of your IS career, what are some of the most memorable events that you have taken with you? That'd be great to hear.
Well, the most memorable is always the start. I mean, here this young man born in Kerala, educated in Chennai and in Delhi. He gets assigned to Bihar, and then I go to my first subdivision was Khagadia. In the aspirational district rankings, with one of the poorest and most backward districts of India, even today Khagadia is almost at the bottom. But one thing I found is that the poorer the area, the more backward the area, the kind of impact that you can have and how welcoming the local people are. And there is so little expectation from government because of series of failures that when they see somebody who is young, who is wanting to make a change, is willing to take personal risks, they stand with you like no other. And what's great about Bihar, I think, is much maligned. But I think what's great about Bihar's administration is that when you do that, you get support that is unique. That is not to say that you don't feel let down many a time, but that's in the nature of the trade, of the job. I mean, the IS or work as a civil servant is certainly not for the weak-hearted. But it offers you the kind of opportunity at an age which nothing else, I think, in the world will offer you. But then you have to take it in a particular spirit. And most importantly, in fact, if you ask me, the biggest inadequacy I had, and that inadequacy actually matured over time, is almost a complete lack of understanding of the nature of politics and how that politics interfaces with demands that are placed on the civil services. So to understand the roots of that momentum and to work in a way that will lead to system change over time. I mean, what's the rationale for the existence of a so well protected, constitutionally protected service in this country? It's only because to help you if you ask me, is to help you speak truth to power, but in an informed way, not in a way that simply promotes your own sense and need for taking the moral high ground. Just servicing that craving of yours can be sometimes hugely dysfunctional, and it's another form of corruption if you actually ask me.
Interesting.
Because the people of India have spent so much on you, and yet if you are not in a position to deliver on that, given the constraints, then you're letting them down. So in that sense, it's a, but let me also tell you that it's been one failure after the other. But one learned from every failure. And And I think the more and the best part of that career really was two of my postings. One, each one of them were fabulous. One was when I got a chance to manage the drought in Palamu, 1992 to 94, and the kind of system changes, the Pani Panchayat, giving voice to the Dalits and the tribal population against what was otherwise a socially and politically oppressive order of the district. And all that goes along with it. And the second, and was really my time, in 6 years I was a professor of social management at the Lal Bahadur Shastri National Academy of Administration. One could, see the kind of enthusiasm, hope, and idealism with which we got the youngsters coming in, and how they transformed, some not so well, some fabulous, but a lot of middle ground of people, almost I would say 30 to 40 to even 50%, who given the right circumstances will do an extremely good job. And again there is the other 20 to 25% who would deliver regardless. So understanding that and then the opportunity that government gave me to pursue an MSc and then a PhD at the University of Sussex at the Institute of Development Studies was another great period for me of learning, of reflecting. And I came back with analytical capabilities which I'm surprised at myself.
A lot of the imagery around an IS officer is ranging from power to Lal Batti Ki Gadi to immense opportunities to make money. But there's probably a different side of that. Could you share some of the pieces that are equally as exciting, equally as aspirational, but are not known to the general public that's just thinking of IS as another way of improving the dowry that one could potentially get to regain the social status coming from very remote parts of India. But I'm sure there's a positive side of the IS story also in addition that people don't know. What is that?
No, but let me just sort of try and answer the other part, that if that is what you come into the IAS for simply improving your social standing, of course it does. And to be able to make money or to use the state for your own personal or your family's sort of upliftment, then you will come to grief rather early. I'm not saying that they will not survive in the system. Yes, they will survive in the system, but they will survive with a taint which will be telling, because let's face it, we as a country still respect people who stand for what is right. And although it may be difficult initially, there are sources of support. Let me tell you this whole thing from another perspective. If you look at the chief minister, who really, as an IS officer, most of your time is, at least the early years, are spent in your state. The chief minister is head of an administration. He makes choices about who to place where. And what he does really is he looks at what are the strengths and weaknesses of this person. And then he places you precisely in the job in which people think you are fit for. Now, if you need to be, if you are fit for a corrupt job and you're willing to pay money to whoever needs to be paid money for, that's exactly the job you will get. If, however, you are a person who is in a position to use the training that you have, the abilities that you have to improve the social good, that's exactly the posting you will have. So in a certain sense, you create, at least in the first few years that's not the case, but then in 4 to 5 years, you create a reputation for yourself. And it is that reputation that largely decides. I'm not saying that an exception normally proves the rule, therefore I'm not saying there are no exceptions, and therefore it's not difficult. But then looking at opportunities, that's the kernel of the question that you asked me. 1992, I'm born in 1961, okay? I have an entire district to run, and that's a district of Palamu. At that age in our country, where do you get this opportunity? Every department depends on you, reports to you. Government's faith and their ability to run that district is upon your ability to bring this whole thing together. And then what happened was we had this drought. And the standard response of drought to Palamu is that let's sanction a few big dams. I was able to take a position which said that, listen, that's not what we want. In fact, if Palamu has drought, it is a complete failure of our imagination and our thinking and our planning. Because never in the history of Palamu have we had rainfall that is less than 700 millimeters.
Okay.
700 millimeters. And the thing is that nobody ever knew this data point. So when I had the Prime Minister who was visiting to check on this, the governor, the chief, when I made this point that, you know, they were all stunned to know that 700 millimeters in drought. I think that's the role of the IAS officer, to be able to find the things that are what we call in management terms root cause analysis, right, and to work around it. So what we really did there was to organize people, particularly Dalits and scheduled castes, who are the dominant, you know, in terms of numbers, but were so disempowered, make their land productive by working on the system of ahars and pines that were there for centuries but had fallen into disuse.
Right.
So use the extra resources that we were getting to actually build for the future, but in a way that what we did was we organized them into Dalits and tribals, we organized them into Pani Panchayats. And around them, there was a social mobilization around them that we built the physical structures. I'm not saying we succeeded, there were problems. But an approach that has a much more nuanced understanding of the socio-political realities and try to do the programming that can, you know, deal with those complexities is where the IAS really comes into its own. But let me also say that you know, in the 1980s, when we were in the district, 80s and 90s, I joined the IAS in 1985. Those were still days in which politics was fueled more by patronage. So, in a certain sense, the hallmark of a good officer was a person who can also deliver patronage and also some results. And the balance was skewed in terms of patronage and less in results. But now what has happened is India has fundamentally changed. And the change in India that has happened is that politics today is way ahead of the ability of the state to deliver. So today you have the electoral salience for public service delivery. And if you ask me, health and education are two things that are just waiting to be taken, you know, nurtured and harvested for electoral gain. But we can't do that. We can't do that because our political leadership is not in a position to be able to offer this to the public, because they have no confidence that the state as currently constructed has the ability to deliver on things like this, which require multi-year nuanced programming. That, I think, is really where we are stuck as a country.
What would it take for politicians to regain their faith in using the health and education, you know, agenda on the manifesto to get that?
According to me, the way the state was constructed in India, it was actually constructed for the colonial purpose. So what we are good at, for example, is maintaining law and order, perpetuating the status quo, and if there are big and critical events like an earthquake, a drought, flood, or an epidemic, then we close ranks, all sort of energies are diverted, and we focus on a single problem. We are good at that. But the ability of the state to able to, like I said earlier, this multi-year nuance program, which is what education health is all about, we still don't have the capabilities. Therefore, what we really need to do is, A, we need to actually take a fundamental relook at what we mean by performance management in government at one level. Second, we need to put in a data infrastructure which can speak to a performance management engine. And we need to look at government's entire entire approach of government to people management, which starts with hiring, training, coaching, performance management, management of the alumni, people who either retire or you leave. I mean, some of the best ideas and wisdom and practical experience may actually exist in your alumni. Good organizations actually benefit from all of these. So the people management part of government is, I think, where we really need. Now, here I'm not talking just of the higher parts of the civil service, like the forest service or the foreign service or the police service or the administrative service or the central services like income tax or whatever. We also, I'm also talking of them, and more so in the middle management structures in government. If you find states that do well, these are states where the local cadres are. I mean, you go to Kerala, for example, you cannot find out the difference between an IAS officer and a state civil service officer. There's almost the same case in Tamil Nadu, almost the same case in Andhra. And that's not the case in the poorer parts of India, let me put it that way. So a lot of effort has to go into building those cadres, sustaining them, giving them the opportunities, enabling them to be in a certain sense fit for purpose. And by the way, this needs political leadership, and it needs political leadership that's willing to look beyond a 5-year electoral cycle, because a 5-year electoral cycle means that you literally have only 3 years to do serious work. First year is the euphoria, and the last year and a half is basically on preparation for the next. So we need a leadership that's able to look beyond that, and a leadership that has the capacity to deal with failure. Because much of our problems in government today is because we have a complete intolerance for failure.
But we've heard that the IAS is a stable job, that you never get fired, you can afford to make mistakes, you can do many of those things. So clearly the system is allowing to learn from those failures, no?
Yeah, that's very interesting. It's true. I don't lose my job, but I get tossed around in such a way that the costs at a personal level can be very high. But if you want systems to improve, your question is from the point of view of an individual IAS officer or an individual police officer. But if you want the system to move, to deliver, then you need an alignment of a number of things, and it cannot be the sole heavy lifting that an individual will do, which is what really is making many of the things happen. So therefore, there is a systems design issue, an alignment of incentives issue.
What advice would you have for people who are aspiring to join the services, someone who's preparing for the IAS system? What are those investments that they should be making to achieve success in this career?
The first point I want to make, it's not advice, but the first point I want to make is that don't even try getting into the IAS or the senior civil services unless you really are motivated to be an agent of change. Unless the public purpose is so high up in your aspiration for yourself, don't try it. You're going to be extremely frustrated. You can make much better money outside. But if you have the public purpose in mind, and in India, we don't have a shortage of problems, nor a shortage of opportunities. India is not some sort of pauperized country in some part of the world. I don't want to call out any particular continent. We have the resources today. We have the politics that rewards good work today. And therefore, you are going to enter India and its government at a time which is so promising. But if you want to be really successful, all I would urge you to think about is you, and this I'm not sure the IAS training per se equips you for it, but of course the life in the IAS will, and that is to have the ability, the intellectual curiosity, and the tools and the equipment, as it were, to digest the latest in economics, in politics, and in the social sphere. Today there is so much, this fantastic work that's actually going on the frontiers of our knowledge, whether it's technology, whether it's whether it's behavioral economics, whether it is more better understanding of managing large systems, or even financing. So the days of a fixer administrator who actually fixed things for his political boss, I'm not saying is gone, but it's going. And I can see the green shoots of this. I've even experienced it, is that when you have these great abilities to bring knowledge, the frontiers of knowledge, and the ability to localize it for local solutions. By local, I don't mean village level, because you will typically work at a subdivision, district, state and country level. To be able to work that, that's when you will set yourself up for success. And the reason why I say it's important that you do that, because if you are coming in as a person who simply takes orders and simply fixes for your boss, whatever, I mean, your boss can ask you to fix things that are in the public interest and may not be so much in the public interest. But if you are just, I'm not using fixer in a very negative sense, but a person who can get things done, if that's all your sort of ability is, then you're setting up yourself for high risk and probably multiple failures. If on the other hand, you actually built yourself up as what I would call the scholar administrator, then what will happen is that when serious problems hit the system, then it is to you that they will turn for solution advice, number one. So what you create, there is an internal market that's evolving within government for people who have that ability to think, to ideate, and to be able to design both policy and to what is India's great problem, which is actually the execution deficit. If you have that ability, the macro, micro, people management skills, the ability to see financing in a creative way, then the internal markets work in your favor. Not only that, if something, God forbid, goes horribly wrong, then there is a market even outside the government that's available for you. And the moment you are aware that both these markets are existing, then you are able to negotiate with the system from a position of strength rather than from a position of weakness. You no longer then become the supplicant requesting for a job. You are the person who will do what needs to be done, and the system comes to you when the time is appropriate. I'm not saying you will always have a nice, you'll have fantastic jobs, you will always be Secretary of Finance. That's not what I'm saying. But you will be respected, and the system will have use for you, especially because of our understanding of where politics in India today is.
What you're saying is by being abreast with the latest developments, picking up new skills, things that are very common in the corporate sector where you don't want to become redundant. So even though the IS gives a lifetime guarantee of job security, if one were to make those investments, one would have that security regardless of whether it comes from the services or from the sector. And because of that security, your ability to take bold initiatives, your ability to do things differently, your ability to stand up for what's right also goes up proportionally. Is that
absolutely?
When I think about solving a social development problem, I think about starting my own NGO. I think about joining a top-notch consulting firm in their social development practice. I think about starting a company that could potentially come with products to solve this. Rarely do I sort of think that the IS could provide me with an opportunity to create a large-scale, sustainable solution. This is partly emanating from the fact that I would have rotations in multiple departments. It could be because there isn't enough historic precedence. Like, when did we hear of an inventor from the IS community? Like, how should a social development entrepreneur think about these multiple choices that they have as different careers to achieve the goal that they have in mind, the public service goal that they have in mind?
The great thing about government service is that you can be an entrepreneur without the downside financial risks associated with that entrepreneurship. see, the initial days you are a sub-divisional officer, you're in the districts, it's a different kind of a job. You're there to implement the government's policies. But the moment you come into policy making, or rather, I wouldn't say policy making, because the making is by the political executive, but the advisory role, then you're really like an entrepreneur there. And you're a public service entrepreneur here, and you have the entire might and the financial resources of the state. Just not the financial resources, but the legal framework with which the state in India operates to able to, I wouldn't use the word play, but to design your solution with. And that can be intoxicating. So my rule when I was in government for 32 years, I was in government, and then I left, I took VRS after 32 years. And my last posting was chairperson of the National Council for Teacher Education. I had this rule. My rule was that I would spend 10 hours of a day working on what government wanted me to do. But I would never go to bed without working 2 to 3 hours without working on what I wanted my government to do.
Ah, nice.
And what I wanted government to do was actually the leftovers of the many postings that I had.
Wow.
So for example, if I may, one of the most exciting pieces of work that I did was when for almost 3 years, I was Principal Secretary Rural Development in the Department of Rural Development in Government of Bihar. When I worked with Abhijit Banerjee, Esther Duflo, Rohini Pandey and Clement on actually designing one of the world's largest RCTs, randomized controlled trials, where we were working on a hypothesis that if you ease the finance constraint on MGNREGS, the great thing about MGNREGS is that you can put 20,000 rupees almost into the hands of poor people,
right,
sustainably every year on year. And can you imagine if every poor person in Bihar, every poor family in Bihar had access to a 20,000 rupee sort of income guaranteed literally for the rest of their life? I mean, just simply your nutrition problems for one gets to solved, and all the cognitive problems that comes out of that begins to get solved. Your ability to even think,
right,
and to, it changes. And yet it was not happening. Bihar had one of the highest levels of rationing on MGNREGs at the time. Almost 60% of the people who want an MGNREGS work couldn't get it. So this is what we hypothesized. And what we really did was that I'm telling you this as an example to tell you how exciting it is to be able to be an entrepreneur within government. And remember, I'm taking Abhijit's name or Esther's name to be able to demonstrate that you are not working on your own. If you're willing to reach out, if you can demonstrate that you have the intellectual curiosity and the equipment to be able to deal with the best scholars in the world, it's a natural partnership. It's almost a match made in heaven. So they need a field, we need the insight. And if you can actually bring these two together, what better way? But the point I'm making is, so our hypothesis was that, so in most government schemes, what happens is that government pushes money down. So if you have 3 lakh rupees to spend, 3 lakh crore rupees, 1.5 lakh crore rupees will be pushed down to the various levels. Center to state, state to district, district to block, maybe block to panchayat, depending on what is the nature of the scheme. So remember, and most of this is borrowed money. And then when you have a 60% expenditure of this 1.5 lakh crore, remember the number, that's when you come back for your second installment. So the panchayat comes for the second installment to the block, block comes to the district, district comes to the state. But as Principal Secretary Rural Development, I found that, 30% of my blocks were without money, 30% were sitting on lots of money because of some political dysfunctionality or some administrative dysfunctionality, and I couldn't hit my 60%. So you have plenty and scarcity coexist. Number one. Number two, what's the incentive for the well-performing panchayat leadership? You spend money, you're stuck, no more money. And you have to wait till, every Tom, Dick and Harry panchayat comes to think before I can actually get. So all we said, we will not send money down. We'll set up the electronic marketplace by which you give us the muster roll, which we'll upload on the public sphere. And based on that, we'll keep on giving you money So you're not dependent on somebody else's success for yours, you're dependent on your success for your success. So it's also an alignment of incentives. So this is what we did. And guess what we found? Rather than a galloping expenditure, we found that over 20% reduction in expenditure.
Wow.
We were aghast. But then, thank God, I was working with some of the best minds in the world, and we had together put around a 7,000 household survey, and the survey showed us that what really happened was the laborers, the workers, were not getting any money less. Their payments were exactly the same before in those areas where we did the experiment and those areas where we did not the experiment. What really happened was corruption went. And how did corruption go? Because real-time uploading of muster rolls in the public domain, and they felt at a greater threat because they were under the watchful eyes. Whether this will sustain over time is time will tell. But that's the result that we got.
As an entrepreneur, you almost created tens of thousands of crores of savings that the government could then redeploy into other sectors, do more initiatives and innovation.
And the ideas of tapping into the best intellectual sort of frontier.
Yes.
I mean, the best minds in the world working alongside you in one of the poorest parts of the world to come up with solutions.
So you've recently transitioned from the services to the philanthropy sector. What was the rationale behind that?
So 32 years in government was a long time. I'm grateful for the opportunity. I've learned a lot in my own little way, tried to make contributions. But one thing that, that kept surfacing is that we are today in a state of our evolution as a country where we need to do certain difficult things, which are, as I said, long term. The certainty of success is not there. And given what I call, the hyper accountability of a middle income democracy, where there is really very little tolerance for failure, whether in our parliament, in our bureaucracy, I felt that there is a role for outside agencies to actually work with the state to be able to conquer some of these otherwise long-term and more complex problems. Let me give you a sort of an explanation, little more explanation on this. So I think there are four kinds of money. One is the tax rupee that is spent domestically, and that's your classical budget and what government expenditure is all about.
Right.
The second type of money is the tax rupee that is spent abroad. That's called bilateral aid. India, for example, is spending substantial resources in giving bilateral aid to countries in the region and to countries in Africa as part of our bilateral aid program. For many years, India was a bilateral aid recipient. We still have some bilateral aid coming in, but there's also the outflow. Then third is the tax rupee that is aggregated and spent, which is your multilateral institutions, United Nations, World Bank, or the regional cooperation sort of agencies. And all these, tax dollar, tax rupee, whichever way you call it, have got their strengths and weaknesses, especially from an accountability lens and tolerance for failure, ability to take long, risky bets. They have their own features.
Right.
So as a programmer inside, as a person who was, I always saw myself as a social development entrepreneur working inside government. Increasingly, I found that I was able to be more successful when I was able to tap financial resources that had parts of at least two, sometimes three. For example, I was Joint Secretary Skills in the Ministry of Rural Development. People do not know that we ran perhaps at that time one of the largest skilling programs in the country. I had over 12 to 15,000 crores of rupees in investments with private companies. And one of the problems I came up with is that we really do not have a predictor for success. We do not know that when a school dropout, rural poor youth comes to us saying that he wants to get skilled, we have no science around judging the probability that person will fit for this trade or whether this person is fit for wage employment at all. So this really meant that we needed big data, we needed the analytical firepower of a million regressions, as it were. And I knew it was something I couldn't fund from government. So what did I do? I actually went to the Indigo. I think Indigo as a product. Indigo is one company which is domestic and has, to a very large extent, solved the execution problem. So I went to them and said, give me your philanthropy money. Don't give me the money, but can you set up a team that will do data mining for me? Can run the million regression, set up the data structure, so that using data, we can build a predictive model, not for the purpose of keeping a rural poor youth person away from my center because I want to achieve high rates of success, but I know what is the mitigating strategy that I need to put in place for me to get success. So that's an example of how. So having seen this, I felt that, given my sort of work abroad. By the way, I'm not sure how many people know that of the 32 years I spent in government, 6 years was as a professor at the National Academy of Administration. 3 years I was country director of a Rockefeller program called Leadership for Environment and Development. That is 6 + 3, 9. And almost 6 years I was doing my PhD and my MSc at Sussex, which really meant that I'd spent a lot of time outside the hardcore system. So every time I worked in the system, I was like a new kid on the block with lots of new energy, lots of new insights. I was able to bring this, and I consciously did that to remain current. The other is to bring new ideas and to keep maintaining my energy levels. So but I saw how difficult it is to able to harness these resources because there's a lot of information asymmetry. So I thought maybe the time has come. I mean, I had 4 years left in government if I had remained. Rather than spend my last 4 years in government, maybe I should spend time on the other side, educating the other side about the immense possibilities that their tax dollar, their philanthropic rupee, can actually do with the opportunities that exist in their government, provided we can find the reform champions and the social, political context within which to take up action.
Right.
So my idea is to dedicate the next 10 years of my life, and with that I will hang up my boots, is really to help the philanthropy sector spot those opportunities, give them, help them with frameworks with which they can understand how they should, intervene in countries such as India.
There's a rise in philanthropy happening in India with the 2% corporate CSR money coming in, with a fair bit of, high net worth individuals realizing and signing up for the giving pledge. So there is a lot of philanthropic capital coming in from people who may not have the time to think before giving thoughtfully, right? So the main agenda of the corporate is to continue and grow its business. The main agenda of the high net worth individual is to do what they've been doing. But they now have this money, they have this intent to give. When they are giving, what are some 3 points they should keep in mind? How should they decide where to give, how much to give, for each project? Any kind of pointers for people who are giving as to how to give thoughtfully would be great.
See, the struggle for a person who's earned this money to great effort, and it's a lifetime of work that really generates a surplus with which they can actually make this spend, they would like it to be impactful. And the biggest fear they have is that their money will be wasted.
Yes.
So the first thing that I want them to realize is that they would have certainly made so many mistakes in their pathway to getting where they are, that they need to be realistic, that all of their money is not going to get them. But if they would be a little risk-taking, and if they would either invest their own time or invest in people who have the ability to do the social, political, and the administrative analysis of what are those pain points, particularly with respect to state incapacity, and then work with whom I would call reform champions within government. And those reform champions need not necessarily mean they have to be bureaucrats. It can be a reform champion and be a minister. It can be a reform champion and be an MLA can be a reform champion and be a member of parliament. But reform champions who have access to the machines, levers of state, if you can actually then design a program which, of course, you need the reform champion is obviously one part of the piece, but also the context in which that reform is happening.
Right.
Because there has to be a hard problem to solve, and there has to be a problem which the political incentives crave a solution for.
Right.
You can't be far too ahead of your times in these things, right? For if you want that to succeed. I mean, health and education for me are very good examples of the political will being there, but a conspiracy of silence that is overshadowing our political discourse today because of their inability to promise and then deliver. The point that I'm making is that if you can design an intervention in that particular way, then you will not only spend your rupee and get the satisfaction out of it, but you will also contribute to the much larger goal of nation building.
Right.
So one way to really do that is for philanthropists, high net worth individuals, to try and do their philanthropy work not by themselves, but to build consortiums.
Got it.
And to then bring in people who have spent the years, who have the insights, and you need scale for that. So if you actually come into consortiums or make contributions to institutions that do exist who have that, and that would be far more fruitful and is a good way to go, is my sense.
There are a lot of foreign funders that are looking to contribute to the development of India in a variety of sectors. What is some guidelines for them as they're thinking about what they're all chasing high social returns on capital? What are some steps they can take to ensure that their internal mandates are also met while the greatest public good can also be achieved?
I think if you really have the appetite for risk, look for social entrepreneurs. Look for people who come out of experiences like Pratham or Teach for India or the Gandhi Fellowship. These are people who have taken hard choices at critical points in their life. They've shown commitment. Follow up on some of these individuals, invest in them, let their ideas, give them the risk capital that is required for them for 5 years to chase a dream. Even if 10% come to fruition, you've actually not just built solutions for India, you've created the next level of leadership in the voluntary sector, who much required if we have to progress as a nation. That's number one. Number two, try and identify those areas in the state where there is prolonged inability of the state to actually come up with success, where the question of state incapacity is enduring and is reproducing itself. Then ask what are ways in which those sort of traps can actually be broken loose, and make those investments with a coalition of partners and with reform champions. And in all of this with high quality political and social analysis of the context. Way to go.
What is your read on the capacity in the education sector in India? And how do we build more capacity? How do we get these 10 million teachers and another million education professionals? What is the roadmap for building capacity for this sector?
I think the single most important thing in the education sector is really our teachers. And I'm biased, of course, because of my work in the National Council for Teacher Education. But I think that's where we have to begin. Obviously, that's not the end. What we really have to do is enable both the creativity of our top-class teachers to prosper, to survive, to thrive, and for others to learn from them. But also we need to provide a mechanism by which the not-so-brilliant teachers are able to up their game in a way that is systematic and in a way that is able to produce results. By results, I don't mean that you need to have a 80% pass or a 70% first class. really it's about building your students as individuals, people who are able to deal equally with both success and failure, who have an intellectual curiosity, and who have a moral compass with which they run their lives. And in that sense, what I'm going to say may sound a little contradictory, because I'm going to say that given the vast numbers that we have, and we have to harness technology, not as an end in itself, but as a force multiplier to allow all boats to rise, on the one hand. And on the other, we have to allow people who are extremely good, not just as teachers within the system, but also this huge pool of people who aspire to make a contribution to the sector, maybe as mentors for teachers, maybe as teachers themselves. Allow them to make a contribution, and there I think the state sector schools have a big role to play. So that I don't think we can, at least given the conditions in India, we can think of a situation where private schools are going to deliver this country. Of course, there will be private schools, and they should do what they do, but we have to change processes, capacities. I would even dare to say reward and punishment frameworks. But above all, we will have to give them the tools with which they can uplift. And there, personalized adaptive learning it has a very important role to play. But the problem with personalized adaptive learning is that some people feel that we are trying to substitute a teacher. Some people feel that this is driverless cars of the future. But driverless, teaching and bringing students up and children, making them grow as good citizens with all the attributes I talked about cannot be achieved by a machine. But a good teacher, facilitated with the tools, that's going to make a difference. And I want to call out one of the initiatives that we tried at NCT, which is to set up Diksha, which is the national teacher platform. It was and is an attempt in that direction, is to actually harness the power of digital to aggregate and then make available to others actually a way in which they can get the best of teaching materials, learn from others, and also help the teachers get good objective diagnostics about their students. So it's assessment at one level of students, non-threatening, so that it's a diagnostic for the teacher, and the tools for the teacher to be able to respond. So the idea is just that you don't teach the class, you teach the student, and then you build the capacity of not teachers as one homogeneous commodity, but teacher as an individual, as given their sort of strengths, weaknesses, and the sort of circumstances in which they're called upon to perform. So the roadmap for me really is teachers at the fulcrum, instrumentalities such as Diksha I mentioned. I would also advocate for a substantial rehauling of the way teacher education institutions in this country are set up, are managed, evaluated. I think that's also part of the solution. But having said all this, I think we cannot get away any longer from much higher levels of state investment, allocation of budgets, for example, to both education and health, both of which the human capital issue is really what's going to hit our country. So the roadmap is around more investments by the state. It's about reforming teacher education institutions. It's about supporting teachers with the tools to both progress, thrive, prosper. And we started something called a National Teacher Registry. where it's possible in a coordinated fashion for teachers to be acknowledged, recognized for what they do on an everyday basis.
What are some ideas which can help increase learning outcomes at scale in education?
I had talked about the role of personalized adaptive learning as a way in which we help teachers be more productive in the teaching learning discourse. One of the biggest problems that we have today in the personalized adaptive learning context is that it's largely been a private tech offering. And what happens really in a private tech offering is that you are limited by the scale of the market that you play with. That's a problem which the sort of the unicorns have solved, the Googles or your Facebook, and so they have access to this huge market. Because of this, so products that are today available in the market are not based on a vast enough data source. If in the journey that India takes on using personalized adaptive learning, particularly in its schools, state schools, one thing that India can really make a big contribution, not just to its own people, but to the world and to the science, is to actually help build out a science of learning library. And that can be done when individual states in this country, well, they have these budgets under, Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, and that's money available both for hardware and software, to actually encourage that if the states of India would actually go down the personalized adaptive learning pathway, but do it in a way in which, and that will need contractual, in fact, Government of India has actually issued the guidelines for this, the enabling guidelines for this. Do it in such a way that the platform is delivered from Diksha, the National Teacher Platform, and with arrangements so that the data that flows is actually made available in an anonymized fashion to a group that builds out the science of learning library. Then what happens is that the millions of children who are there, who are interacting with the system, as more data comes in, the science of learning library really gets built. And through that way, the full potential of the technology then becomes available. It's almost like doing a Google in education, but not for Google's private purpose, but for India's and the global public good. That's a great contribution that India can make, and we will only improve with time. And that's a direction I would encourage people in states, particularly education departments, to go.
And are there any current examples of where this is happening that people can look to and aspire to what's doing?
I am aware that in Rajasthan, supported by the Global Innovation Fund, there are some experiments that are going on in using personalized adaptive learning in state schools. There's also some work done in Delhi, and the results from that show that there's been a substantial improvement in learning outcomes. But large-scale government procured systems, I think the first breakthrough we're probably going to have in the Indian state of Andhra Pradesh, where the government has taken a decision to actually use the enabling guidelines recently issued by the Ministry of Human Resource Development in the Government of India to use the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan money for procuring this and then hosting it on the National Teacher Platform in such a way that the science of learning building can happen. So as more and more states follow the leadership that Andhra has shown, I think we have the green shoots of hope in this sector.
Great. Thank you so much for coming and sharing the pearls of wisdom. I very much learned a lot from this session. Appreciate your time in doing this. Thank you, Dr. Santhosh Mathew.